afternoon. My name is Melissa Duros, and I'll be discussing the research study, Costly Communication and Learning from Failure in Organizational Coordination by Dietmar Fair. The purpose of this study was to research how existing groups will react to a changing environment when they are combined into one group. In the experiment, the researcher formed two groups and had them create a community atmosphere by repeatedly performing a minimum effort game. During this time period, the groups were then able to establish a coordination history. The groups were then combined, and unlike previous studies, the participants would communicate with one another for a small fee. Although communication was mandatory for success, only 1 out of every 2 participants was willing to implement this communication. The study showed that those who previously proved to be less efficient in the game playing realized the importance of communication and the breakdown that would occur with it. These participants were more likely to want to use communication. In many economic instances, the coordination proves to cause conflict, and organizational constructs are no different. Because coordination amongst groups is essential, there have been many previous studies done in an effort to assist in organizational conflict amongst groups. The focus of this study is to uncover the problems that arise when two groups who have developed a type of harmony are then put together, and the particular area of interest is observing the implementation of communication before the combined group begins their gameplay. When groups did not implement this communication, it proved to be detrimental to their play, while those that did were able to coordinate on the Pareto efficient outcome. Research showed that the groups that decided to implement the communication were those whose previous performance availability was less. The groups who experienced success in their smaller groups were less apt to communicate with each other before playing, even though the results of the group's previous outcome were shared. It is important to note that the groups who had experienced failure in their prior playing were more likely to learn from that failure and understand the necessity of the communication plan. The understanding of how people behave in this type of setting is essential for organizations in an ever-changing environment. Coordination conflicts can occur when two companies merge together or there is an instance of organizational restructuring. These days, as large corporations struggle to stay relevant and change to be nimble, there are many examples of technology company buyouts, company emerging, and even teams being combined to develop new synergies. This type of conflict can occur. Some of these are short-term instances, such as working with a consultant agency, or long-term in the case of buyouts and restructuring. Anxiety can occur as there is a fear of the unknown from the people being combined. They have no history together, they have different processes developed as to how they work day to day, and they are now thrown together to combine as one. During these times, communication such as memos, meetings, and committees can aid in these transitions. Past research in organizational transitions have shown that it can be difficult to determine which transitions have been successful and which have shown to be unsuccessful. The setup in this study, however, shows a clear delineation between what worked and what did not work in these transitions by indicating that those who experienced a past failure were able to understand and implement the communication which led to their successful transition. The participants were to play a minimum effort game in which they determined their effort output. The groups select their effort level. However, regardless of what the group has chosen, past research had shown that larger groups almost always perform at the lowest effort rate, while smaller groups consistently perform at the highest effort rate. To set up, a group of 12 participants were seated at computer terminals and given instructions as to their next steps. They were randomly distributed into groups of 3 and were to perform the game. They received feedback as to their minimum effort as a group, and then after 10 rounds, were combined with another group to form a new team of 6. This type of transition is very typical to organizations where a project team is finished and then a new team is set up quickly to work on another feature. The new groups of 6 were then informed as to what the minimum effort of the prior group had selected. As the new groups were formed, the participants were told what past effort the group had decided upon and used that as an indication of their past behavior. The subjects then decided together, knowing their past success and failure rate, whether or not to institute a communication round before the game began. The communication would be in the form of flashing nonverbal number signs to decide on the new group minimum effort. The focus on this was not to determine whether the participants thought that the communication would assist them in their performance, but whether or not the subject saw communication as a factor. In order to determine this, 2 control subjects were planted to check how the implementation of communication or non-communication impacted performance. The newly set up groups voted on communication stage after knowing 3 items. First, that they would be combined into a newly formed group, the minimum effort of each prior group, and the details of the technology used in round 11. The group would then discuss their voting decisions, which earned them 0.15 cent if they were accurate on the other's decisions. One group member would then be randomly selected to implement their vote of communication or no communication. If that one group member chose communication, it would be implemented. The main difference of this study was that there was a cost for communication. Each group had to pay 10% of the payoff when communication took place, and there was no cost if no communication took place. This was equated to organizational cost when employees are engaged in communication, such as engaged in meetings, writing emails, or on phone calls. The purpose for calling on one random group member was to determine each group member's apropos towards communication and avoid groupthink. This communication stage was irreversible during play, and because of this, communication would then be used in all 10 rounds. The groups could, however, play 5 rounds and then vote again on communication. Revision could depend on the success of the group's previous games. The results were made up of 204 students at Technical University Berlin of varying majors of economics, engineering, sciences. The earnings were determined by randomly selecting the members, and the experiment lasted around an hour. As you can see, the majority of the effort choices in round 1 were above 10. However, by round 10, the minimum effort shifted drastically to the lower effort choices. The group results were statistically significant, verified via a Wilcoxon signed rank test with a p-value of less than 0.01. Results also showed that while the minimum effort of 52% of groups was 20 in round 1, there was a significant shift in round 10 for the groups to choose a minimum effort value of 0. Most of the shift also occurred in rounds 1 through 5. In rounds 6 through 10, 56 out of 68 groups held a flat minimum effort decision. An important item to note that was some subjects tended to ignore the information on previous gameplay and therefore put little weight on observed behavior. Subjects who chose a 10 for minimum effort in the first rounds relied more on their background information and own experience, which shaped their views on coordination failure and subsequently their vote for communication. On the other side, those that came from more successful groups and a higher minimum effort may have not understood the difficulty in coordination. The inference from these groups was that successful subjects underestimated the potential for conflict in the combination of groups having subjects with different effort levels and success rates, and also ignored the information that could have assisted in their new game outcome. From the results table, it is evident in all 10 rounds, groups who used communication chose a higher individual effort and therefore resulted in choosing a higher minimum effort. Results showed that groups who chose to implement communication both achieved higher effort and showed to be more coordinated than those without. The hypothesis that the payoffs would be the same with and without communication can be rejected via a Mann-Whitney test, with the p-value being less than 0.075. This experiment focused on the organizational conflict which can occur when 2 previously performing teams are combined into one new group. Although a high level of communication can be exponentially beneficial to these new teams, there are some groups which will decline to implement this helpful measure. The study also saw that individuals with different prior experiences can have an impact on both performance, but also their recommendation for communication in their new group. It shows that a larger group size also has an effect on the outcome of the performance, and that groups who choose not to use a communication as a tool, which perform at a lower minimum effort than those who do. Although there was evidence that the larger groups had some negative impact on performance, as we saw in the groups of 14 to 16 people, it was thought that there is a larger potential for miscommunication between group members. Even with the larger groups being an issue, there are clear results which show that communication has a successful impact on performance. The researcher mentioned to use caution when using this study in the field, as this was lab research, but noted that learning from failure plays a large role in communication and success. Thank you for your time today, and I open it up now to any questions.